The Forbidden Room. The house looked ordinary at first glance, the kind of place families dream of when they want to escape the chaos of the city. It stood quietly on the edge of a small countryside village, surrounded by thick woods and a narrow road that rarely saw visitors. Its white paint had long faded to a pale yellow, and ivy clung to its walls as though the earth itself tried to pull the home back into silence. To the new family, the Harrisons, it was perfect. Affordable, spacious, and secluded. They moved in with bright smiles and hopeful hearts, believing this would be the fresh start they needed. Inside, the house smelled faintly of dust and old wood, the scent of a place long forgotten. The floors creaked under their steps, the walls carried stains of age, but the charm of it all seemed to cover any unease. Every room told a story, the kitchen with its cracked tiles, the living room with its massive fireplace, the staircase that groaned with each climb. But it wasn't until they explored the upstairs hallway that they noticed something odd. At the very end of the corridor stood a single wooden door, darker than the rest. While the other doors bore golden handles polished by time, this one had an old iron latch, heavy and rusted. Its surface was scarred, as though someone had scratched at it with sharp nails. When Mr. Harrison tried to turn the latch, it didn't budge. Locked. That's strange, he muttered, rattling it again. His wife, Claire, raised an eyebrow. Maybe it's just a storage room. Before he could respond, the landlord, an elderly man who had been helping them move their belongings, spoke sharply. His voice, usually calm and courteous, carried a tone that demanded attention. "Do not open that door." The family froze. The old man's eyes were stern, his wrinkled hand gripping the stair rail as if the weight of his words could not stand alone. "That room has been locked for years. It's not safe. Whatever you do, stay up." Mr. Harrison forced a laugh to lighten the moment. "Unsafe like the floorboards are weak." But the landlord did not laugh. He shook his head slowly, his lips pressed into a thin line. "Some doors are better left closed. Trust me on this." The family exchanged uneasy glances. It felt strange to be warned so firmly, especially about a room in their own home. Claire tried to ask what he meant, but the landlord simply waved his hand and muttered, "You'll be happier not knowing." Then he turned away, leaving them with more questions than answers. Over the next few days, the Harrisons tried to ignore the door. They filled the other rooms with furniture, hung family photos on the walls, and laughed over shared dinners. Life began to settle into routine. But the door at the end of the hallway refused to be forgotten. Every time someone walked past it, they felt its presence, like a shadow that lingered even when no light was there. The children, curious by nature, asked about it constantly. "Why can't we open it?" their daughter Emma pressed. What's inside? Their son, Jacob, dared to knock on it once, and though no sound came back, he whispered later that it felt like something was listening. Claire scolded him for saying such things, but she too found herself pausing at the door at night. She couldn't explain why, but there was a heaviness in the air around it, a sense that it didn't belong to the rest of the house. When she pressed her ear against the wood, she thought just for a moment she heard something faint. Like a sigh. Or a whisper. Mr. Harrison grew frustrated with the mystery. He brought up the idea of breaking the lock, claiming they had a right to know what was inside since they were paying for the whole house. But every time he voiced the thought, a strange chill crept over the hallway, and the words seemed to die in his throat. One evening, after the children were asleep, Claire found her husband standing in front of the door again. He wasn't touching it, only staring, his brow furrowed as though he were listening to something she couldn't hear. "What are you doing?" she asked softly. He blinked, startled, then shook his head. "Nothing. I was just thinking." But Claire could tell he wasn't being honest. The door remained locked, silent yet loud in its presence. The family went on pretending life was normal, but the unspoken truth weighed on them all. That door was not just a door. It was a secret. A warning. And though they tried to convince themselves otherwise, deep down, they knew one day, whether by choice or by force, that door would open. The first whisper. The first week passed without incident, but the unease of the locked door never truly left. It was as if the house itself wanted to remind them of its presence. During the day, it was easy to ignore. Sunlight spilled into the windows, laughter filled the rooms, and chores kept everyone busy. But at night, when shadows stretched long across the walls and silence crept into the corners, the door at the end of the hall began to demand attention. It started subtly. One evening, as Claire tucked Emma into bed, she paused. Somewhere in the distance, faintly, she thought she heard a murmur. It was so soft she dismissed it as the wind sneaking through the trees outside. She kissed her daughter for it, pulled the blanket tight, and turned off the lamp. Yet when she stepped into the hallway, the sound returned low, muffled, almost like someone speaking through a wall. She froze. The sound was coming from the locked room. "Richard," she whispered, thinking maybe her husband was on the other side of the hallway, but there was no answer. She leaned closer, her breath shallow. For a moment, the whisper faded, swallowed by the silence of the house. She exhaled in relief and shook her head. It had to be her imagination. But the following night, it came again. This time, Richard heard it too. He was sitting in the living room, the fire burning low, when he noticed something faint beneath the crackling wood. A whisper. The hairs on his arms stood on end. He turned off the television and listened harder. Yes, there it was. A voice, distant but sharp, threading through the house like smoke. "Claire," he called, his voice shaky. She came down the stairs, frowning. "Do you hear that?" he asked. They both stood still. For a long moment, there was nothing. Then, soft and chilling, the whisper slipped through the air again. It was coming from upstairs. From the door. Neither of them dared move closer that night. They stayed downstairs until sleep overcame them, pretending the sound was nothing but an old house settling into itself. But both knew they had heard something real. On the third night, the whispers grew bolder. Emma woke in the middle of the night, clutching her blanket. She could hear it right outside her room. A voice, soft but calling her name. "Emma." Her heart raced. She pulled the covers over her head, telling herself it was just a dream. Yet the whisper persisted, slithering under her blanket, curling into her ears. "Emma, come play." The little girl whimpered and shut her eyes tight. She didn't scream. Something inside her told her not to. Instead, she pressed her hands against her ears until the sound finally faded. In the morning, she told her mother. Claire brushed it off with a smile, though fear lingered behind her eyes. "Just a bad dream, sweetheart," she said. But when Emma insisted it wasn't, Claire found herself glancing down the hallway, her skin prickling. That night, Jacob had his turn. He was half asleep when he heard his name whispered directly into his ear. His eyes flew open, but his room was empty. He sat up, clutching his pillow, and glanced at the door. Slowly, as if pulled by an unseen hand, his eyes drifted to the end of the hallway. The locked door stood in the dark. Something moved behind it, He could hear the whisper again, faint but deliberate, "Jacob, open the door." Terror rooted him in place. He didn't dare move or breathe until morning light broke through the curtains. The next day, the family could no longer dismiss it as imagination. One by one, they confessed what they had heard. Each story matched the other whispers in the night, voices calling their names. The children were frightened. Claire was pale with worry. Richard tried to remain the voice of reason, but his hands trembled as he spoke. "It's an old house," he insisted. "Sound carries strangely here. That's all." But even he did not believe his own words. That evening, after putting the children to bed, Richard and Claire stood together in the hallway. The door loomed before them, silent and still. They stared at it, neither willing to take a step closer. Then, without warning, the whisper came again, louder this time, clearer than ever before. It wasn't just a murmur now. It was a voice that knew them. "Richard," Claire grabbed her husband's arm, her nails digging into his skin. He swallowed hard, his eyes locked on the dark wood. The whisper continued, mocking, taunting, each word rolling through the air as if the speaker stood just on the other side. "Claire, let me out." The silence that followed was worse than the whisper itself. They backed away slowly, hearts pounding, neither daring to look away from the door. For now, it stayed closed. But they knew the truth. Something was inside. And it knew their names. And when it did, whatever waited inside would not be kind. The door opens. The storm arrived without warning. Heavy rain lashed against the windows, thunder rolled across the countryside, and lightning split the sky in jagged streaks of white. The Harrisons huddled inside, trying to pretend it was nothing more than a normal summer storm. But the house seemed different that night. It breathed with the weather, every crash of thunder rattling its bones, every gust of wind shaking its frame. The whispers returned too. Not soft anymore, not distant, they were everywhere. They slipped beneath the floorboards, threaded through the walls, and lingered in the air like smoke. The family gathered in the living room, the fire long extinguished, as if staying together might keep the voices away. But the voices weren't just in the walls. They were calling names again, stretching and twisting them, making them sound strange. Richard heard his name first, then Claire's, then the children's. Each whisper was clearer than the last. And then, above the roar of the storm, something echoed from the upstairs hallway. Click. It was faint, but unmistakable. The sound of a latch being released. Richard shot to his feet, his face pale. Claire clutched the children close, her heart thundering louder than the storm itself. "No," Richard whispered, his eyes fixed on the staircase. "It can't be." But it was. The door at the end of the hall had unlocked itself. Slowly, with a groan that cut through the storm, it began to open. The sound was unbearable, wood dragging against wood, hinges screaming after years of disuse. It didn't swing wide at once but crept open inch by inch, as though the house itself resisted what lay inside. The family froze, too afraid to breathe. The hallway filled with cold. Not the chill of winter air but something deeper, sharper, as though it came from a place where warmth had never existed. Even from downstairs, they could feel it seeping into their skin, sinking into their bones. Emma whimpered. "Mommy, don't let it out." Claire held her tighter, but she could not move. Richard forced himself up the stairs, his legs heavy as stone. He didn't know what he planned to do, slam the door shut, lock it again, maybe even nail it closed, but every step felt wrong, as if invisible hands tried to pull him back. He reached the top of the stairs. The door stood open now, just a crack, wide enough to reveal the darkness beyond. It wasn't an ordinary darkness, it looked thicker, heavier, as though it wasn't just absence of light but something alive, something that waited. "Stay back," Richard called to his family, though his voice cracked with fear. He approached slowly, the whispers growing louder. They weren't calling his name anymore. They were laughing, mocking, scraping at the edges of his mind. The hallway floor groaned under his steps. The closer he came, the colder the air grew, until he could see his breath drifting in pale clouds. The door yawned wider on its own, creaking slowly as if inviting him inside. And then he saw the walls. Inside the room, faint light from the lightning revealed scratches. Thousands of them. The wood was torn, shredded by something desperate to escape. They covered every surface, floor to ceiling, some deep enough to splinter the boards. Richard staggered back, his heart hammering. That was when he realized some scratches formed shapes. Words. "Let me out. I am still here. Open the door." The whispers surged into a chorus now, louder and louder until they weren't whispers anymore but shrieks. Richard clapped his hands over his ears, but the voices cut straight through. Behind him, Claire screamed. The children had run halfway up the stairs before she caught them, pulling them back into her arms. But her eyes were locked on the doorway. On the shadow. It moved. Something stirred in the darkness of that room. A shape, tall and crooked, with limbs too long to belong to anything human. It swayed as though it were stretching after centuries of confinement. When the lightning struck again, its eyes flashed back a dull, lightless white that fixed directly on Richard. He stumbled backward, nearly tumbling down the stairs, but he couldn't look away. The door slammed wide open with a force that shook the house. Wind burst out of the room, howling down the hallway, carrying with it the stench of rot and decay. The voices screamed in unison now, so loud the walls themselves seemed to shake. Richard scrambled down the stairs, clutching Claire's arm. Together, they ran to the children and pulled them into the living room. The storm outside was nothing compared to the storm inside, the air thick with whispers, the shadows crawling along the walls like living things. And above it all, the sound of footsteps. Slow, deliberate, echoing down the hallway. The room at the end of the hall was no longer locked. It was open. And something had stepped out. The presence revealed. The footsteps were the first sign that it was no longer confined. Slow, steady, unhurried, as though it knew there was nowhere for the Harrisons to run. Each step echoed unnaturally, vibrating through the walls and floors, so that no one could tell if it was above them, behind them, or right in the very room where they crouched. Claire held the children close against her chest, rocking them as if her embrace could shield them from whatever prowled the hallway. Richard stood at the entrance of the living room, gripping a broken chair leg like a weapon. His knuckles were white, his body trembling. The storm outside raged on, but its violence felt safer than the calm, deliberate movements of whatever had escaped the dark room. Then came the voice. Not a whisper anymore. Not a faint murmur through the walls. It was clear now, deep and hollow, like many voices speaking at once. "Thank you," it crooned. "Thank you for opening the door." Richard's grip on the chair leg tightened. "We didn't open it," he hissed, his voice cracking. "You opened it yourself." The thing laughed. A sound that wasn't quite human, not quite animal, but something in between. The walls seemed to vibrate with it, the lamps flickered violently, and the children buried their faces against their mother's chest, sobbing silently. And then, the lights went out. The house fell into darkness, broken only by flashes of lightning seeping through the curtains. In each brief illumination, shadows twisted unnaturally across the walls. Shapes that didn't belong. Limbs that reached further than they should. The children began to whisper. At first, Claire thought it was out of fear, but then she realized they weren't whispering to her. Emma's lips moved silently, her eyes wide and unblinking. Jacob too seemed entranced, staring at a corner of the room with a faint smile, murmuring words that weren't his own. "Stop it!" Claire shook them, desperate to break the spell. "Don't listen." But the voices inside the children's mouths grew louder, until they spoke in unison with the thing in the hallway. "We are not strangers to them, they belong to us." Richard lunged forward, grabbing his daughter's shoulders, shaking her hard enough to break the trance. She blinked rapidly, tears spilling from her eyes as if waking from a nightmare. Jacob screamed as if something had been ripped away from him, his small hands clutching at the air, begging for whatever invisible presence had been holding him to return. The entity laughed again, closer now. Much closer. Lightning struck, and for the first time, they saw it clearly. It stood at the threshold of the living room, its body elongated, twisted like a shadow stretched too thin. Its limbs bent at odd angles, and its face for what resembled one was an abyss of writhing darkness. Only the eyes glowed faintly white, piercing and unblinking, locked on the family huddled before it. Claire's breath caught in her throat. Her instinct screamed to run, but there was nowhere to go. Richard stepped forward, raising the chair leg as though it could make a difference. His voice trembled but carried a father's desperate defiance. "Stay away from my family." The entity tilted its head, the sound of creaking bones filling the silence. Then, slowly, it stepped inside. The air grew heavy, suffocating, pressing down on their chests until every breath was a struggle. Shadows slithered along the floor, curling around the furniture, crawling up the walls like living vines. The whispers returned, but this time they weren't just in the walls, they were inside their minds. Claire heard her mother's voice, long dead, calling her name sweetly, beckoning her into the darkness. Richard heard his father's voice, scolding him, mocking his weakness. The children whimpered as laughter, cruel and endless, filled their heads. "Make it stop," Emma sobbed, covering her ears. But there was no stopping it. The entity drifted closer, its movements fluid, unnatural. It didn't walk, it glided, its shadow stretching across the room to wrap around Richard's feet. He swung the chair leg with all his strength, but the wood passed through the figure as though striking smoke. The force threw him off balance, and he fell hard to the floor. The thing loomed over him, lowering its faceless head until the white glow of its eyes consumed his vision. Richard felt his mind being pulled, torn open like pages ripped from a book. He screamed, clutching his head, thrashing against something he couldn't see. "Daddy!" Jacob shrieked, trying to run to him, but Claire held him back. The entity paused, its head snapping toward the boy. Slowly, it smiled. Not with the mouth, but with the twisting of its shadows, a widening crack of darkness that spread where a mouth should be. "He is mine," the voices said through the children's mouths, through Claire's ears, through the walls themselves. "And soon, so are you." Another bolt of lightning lit the room, and for the briefest moment, the family saw dozens of pale hands pressing against the walls from the inside, as if the house itself was full of trapped souls clawing to escape. Then the light vanished, and the whispers returned in a deafening chorus. The Harrisons realized the truth. The presence wasn't just in the room. It was in the house. And it had always been waiting. The final night. The storm never ended. It should have passed after a few hours, but outside the windows the sky remained black, thunder rolled endlessly, and the rain pounded as if the heavens had opened to wash the earth away. The family knew now that this was no ordinary storm. It was the house's storm. It was the entity's storm. For 3 days, they endured the whispers. Sleep became impossible. Whenever they closed their eyes, voices crawled into their minds, whispering secrets they were never meant to hear, showing them visions of blood, fire, and endless dark hallways with doors that led nowhere. The children cried until their throats were raw, but the voices were merciless. Richard tried to fight. He hammered planks over the forbidden door, prayed aloud, even burned candles until the wax pooled like tears on the floor. But every effort was in vain. The door would not stay shut. The candles blew out. And when he whispered prayers, the voices whispered back, mocking the very words he spoke. By the final night, they were broken. Claire sat on the floor with Emma and Jacob clutched tightly against her, rocking them in silence, her eyes glazed with exhaustion. Richard paced the room, muttering to himself, his hands trembling. They hadn't eaten in 2 days. They hadn't slept in longer. And still, the whispers came. Then the house fell silent. For the first time in days, the voices stopped. The storm outside stilled. The air grew unbearably heavy, pressing down on their lungs. It was too quiet. Richard turned slowly toward the hallway. The door at the end was wide open now. Not cracked, not groaning on its hinges. Wide open, swallowing the hall in black. And something was coming. At first it was only a shadow creeping along the floor, stretching across the wood like spilled ink. But then it grew taller, forming the crooked figure they had come to dread. Its pale eyes glowed faintly as it stepped closer, but this time, it wasn't he alone. Faces pushed against the walls, dozens of them, distorted, screaming silently. The wallpaper bulged and rippled like flesh, as if the souls of all who had lived there before were trapped inside the very structure of the house. Hands clawed from the plaster, reaching for the family with desperate hunger. Claire screamed, pulling the children back, but shadows wrapped around her ankles, dragging her toward the hallway. Richard swung wildly with a kitchen knife he had grabbed in desperation, slashing at the air, but the blade sliced through nothing. The whispers returned louder, harsher, no longer pretending to be soft invitations. They were commands now, echoing in unison, rattling the very bones of the house. Come to us, you belong to us. The children screamed as the entity bent low, its elongated arms stretching unnaturally until its fingers nearly brushed their faces. Emma clutched her doll so tightly that its head snapped off, rolling across the floor. Jacob sobbed, burying his face in his mother's shoulder. Richard threw himself at the creature, stabbing again and again with the knife, screaming like a madman. Leave them alone. He roared, but the shadow only grew thicker, wrapping around him like smoke. His scream was cut short, muffled, as the darkness swallowed him whole. One moment he was there, his face twisted in terror, the next he was gone, his body ripped away into the void. Claire shrieked his name, tears streaming down her face, but she had no time to grieve. The entity turned its faceless head toward her and the children, its eyes burning brighter. The whispers grew deafening, until they were not just in the house but inside her skull. She felt herself slipping. Her grip on her children weakened. For a moment, she thought she saw her mother's face in the shadows, smiling warmly, whispering for her to let go. The temptation was unbearable. But then Emma cried out, her small, terrified voice piercing through the storm of whispers. "Mommy, don't let them take us." The sound snapped Claire back. She clutched her children tight, screaming into the void, "You can't have them." The entity froze. For the first time, it did not move closer. The whispers faltered, as if uncertain. But then, slowly, it smiled again with that crack of shadow. "Not tonight, but soon." With that, the shadow surged forward. The walls split, the ceiling cracked, and the entire house groaned like a living beast. Claire and the children screamed as darkness engulfed them, swallowing their voices, their bodies, their very existence. And then, silence. The storm ceased. The house stood still once more, quiet and calm, as if nothing had happened. The door at the end of the hallway swung shut, sealing itself with a soft click. Days later, a new family arrived. They marveled at the spacious rooms, the countryside charm, and the surprising affordability. The landlord smiled politely, handing over the keys, his eyes weary but resigned. "There's just one thing," he said softly, pointing toward the upstairs hallway. "Don't open that door." That night, when the house settled into silence, faint whispers began again from the end of the hall. And the cycle continued.